So before I start, can you all hear me? In the back, we're good? All right, so now going after that last TED Talk is going to be a little bit strange. Please try not to judge me, render me useless, etc., etc. Right? And I'd like to, especially before I start, give thanks to all of you for attending, and particularly to the group of friends who agreed to come watch me. I cannot tell you how comforting a presence you all are. All right, so let's get started. Now, the topic of my talk is, as you can see, Rwanda. And no, there aren't any subliminal messages in that map. Really, I'm just trying to show you how small the country actually is. It's about the size of Delaware. In fact, I think it's only 36 square miles off of being Delaware. All right. Now, the word I'm going to start off introducing you guys to is development. And for better or for worse, either as a critique or as a definition, economists and people generally think of development as how non-Western countries try and achieve Western standards of economic growth or economic living. And perhaps the best example of development, from an economist perspective, to look at is Rwanda. Because unlike any other country, Rwanda built itself out of absolutely nothing. In 1994, as we already heard, the Rwandan genocide occurred, perhaps one of the most infamous events of the late 20th century. 800,000 to 1 million lives were wiped out just in the first 100 days. And some estimates have that as high as 2 million. And as you can probably imagine, at the end of it, Rwanda had no economy. It had no society. It had no government. There was nothing. It's a land that Paul Kagame, their president, called the land of destruction, destitution, and death. Now, as much as we don't like to talk about it, to build itself up, Rwanda needed a new economic policy. It needed economic growth if it was ever going to have a functioning society again. So how did it do these things? In 2000, the newly formed Rwandan government instituted what's called Rwanda Vision 2020, a now seminal document in international relations and development economics. And the document laid out a series of goals for the year, obviously, 2020. And it said in the areas of healthcare, education, childcare, the economy, etc., etc. It said that there would be a series of goals met in each of these areas. Now, I could list all of these goals, but the one you all need to pay attention to, as citizens and as potential economists, is income per person, or GDP per capita. It's a good metric to measure all kinds of development indicators, and it's something we can all relate to, money in our pockets. And at the time, in 2000, Rwanda's income per person was roughly $220 per year, not very much. And Rwanda said that by 2020, they would raise that number to $900 per year. It still doesn't sound like much by our standard. Our GDP per capita is something the equivalent of like $30,000 a year. But still, it's a lot for a country that just got out of a genocide. In fact, it would make Rwanda a middle-income country. Think Turkey or Brazil as your comparative example. And so to do this, Rwanda had to make some changes. And what it did was actually very simple, a really simple trick. It looked at the outside world, opened its arms up, and said to individuals, to governments, to businesses, to non-governmental organizations, it said, you have money, you have resources, you have capital. Come here to Rwanda and invest in us. Build your projects, build your businesses, and you will make a profit. And in turn, we will do everything in our power to make those things happen. And by and large, the strategy did succeed. Today, rather on estimates, the closest estimates used from 2013, say that Rwanda's income per person is now a good $638 per person. That's 2/3 of the way to its original development goals. But that's not all. Extreme poverty dropped by 14% in the past decade. Child mortality is down. Healthcare and education access are up. All of these kinds of indicators indicate that Rwanda has made progress since the darkest days of the genocide. Now, let me give you just a simple example of the kind of progress I'm talking about. When I visited Rwanda in May of last year, I was able to go to some of the remotest parts of the country. And these areas, you could get very rudimentary 4G access. And that's because Rwanda recently completed a 2,300 kilometer long fiber optic cable that skipped several generations of the old telephone and internet lines that we actually grew up with in the United States. They're trying to turn themselves into a high-tech service economy, modeling themselves off of Singapore. And slowly, ever so slowly, they're making headway. And they've been cited in The Economist, development journals, the New York Times, research papers, etc., as being a great example. But there's more to this story. There's a reason I'm citing Rwanda beyond just promoting it as an example of good economic governance. The simple reason is that for those of you in the room who are my age, who are roughly 20, give or take a few years, this doesn't actually seem that strange to you. Because in the last 20 years, this is the kind of development that we have grown up with. We're very used to people talking about businesses and growth. But to those of you who grew up during the Cold War, particularly before the demise of the Soviet Union, take a moment and think about this, because this should actually seem very, very new to you. In the 20th century, what did we see? We saw 2 world wars, we saw genocides, we saw civil wars, civil strife, governments collapsing left and right, coup d'etats, socialist revolutions, capitalist revolutions, dictatorships. It was an incredible century full of turmoil. And because of this, nations were understandably fearful of exposing themselves to the outside world. The predominant development policy in the 20th century in the developing world was something called autarky, or self-sufficiency, where governments imposed extensive capital and trade controls on letting things into the country. They were very reluctant to open their economies up, to plug themselves into whatever global system did exist. But this all changed in 1990 after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when countries started realizing that in order to grow their economies, in order to rely upon the capitalist model, which seemed to be the only model left, they actually had to get access to capital. Because capital just doesn't appear out of nowhere. Factories, production, investments, if you don't have those things, they need to be brought in from the outside. In fact, this worked for the United States as well. The Industrial Revolution came to the United States after some of the first machinations were imported from Britain. Think of the mills, the early mills that were used for production. And so Rwanda did the same thing. It realized after the genocide that it really didn't have anything to work with. If it ever needed something to work with, it had to bring those things in. Now, there are obvious problems with this kind of policy, and there's opposition that has come to this policy. Because for all the advantages that you get from exposing yourself to the outside world, from exposing yourself to the kinds of influences that can come in from the outside world, you also expose yourself to some obvious weaknesses. Politicians talk about this, economists talk about this, and there's a reason for that. And that's partially what I went to Rwanda to study last May, to talk to business leaders and see what kinds of problems they were having in their economy. And predictably, their biggest problem was vulnerability. Let's take a couple of examples. Let's start with aid. For all the credit that Rwanda gets, 30 to 40% of its government's budget comes from outside sources, from foreign direct investment, from aid and assistance. If that aid were ever cut off, temporarily suspended, gotten rid of, then Rwanda's growth would collapse or slow down. We have 2 examples of this already. In 2009, the global financial crisis swept through the world and wiped out global investments. And Rwanda's growth tanked from an annual average of 8% to down to 2.9%. Again, in 2012, aid was temporarily suspended due to Rwanda's alleged activities right across the border. And the next year, growth fell once again to 4.6%. To those of us in the United States, these numbers are still pretty high. Our economy can barely scratch 2% growth from year to year. But to a country like Rwanda, a country trying to grow out of a genocide, these numbers matter. If Rwanda is to meet its development goals, the World Bank predicted that it would need upwards of 11% growth per year in order to reach $900 a person by 2020. If Rwanda doesn't have growth, it's not going to reach those numbers. It's not going to meet its goals. But the problems only get worse. In order to meet its goals, it has to develop a manufacturing sector. Rwanda is heavily dependent right now on agriculture. But take a look at this map. As you can clearly tell, Rwanda is surrounded by Africa. It doesn't have any access to ports. The nearest port, in fact, that it uses to ship stuff out is Mombasa in Kenya. But even to reach Mombasa, it has to actually transport its goods there. And the infrastructure just isn't that good. There aren't that many railways or road lines that can take you there. And on top of that, even if Rwanda wanted to manufacture more, it's really, really tiny. It has to import things like uranium, iron, tin, copper, all the materials that would actually be used to make something. In fact, its biggest export is actually coffee. So there's one problem. But here's the next one. If it can't rely on manufacturing, Rwanda is going to have to develop a technology and service sector. And it's actually been very successful. But if it wants to rely on a technology and service sector, Rwanda is going to have to find customers. Now, customers aren't going to come from such a small country by itself. Customers are going to come from the surrounding region in Africa, from the East African community, and also from people in Europe and the United States who want to do work in Africa. So once again, Rwanda is dependent on the outside world if it wants to keep growing. It's dependent on the outside world's money and their customers. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, the same goes for other countries that rely on this model of bringing in outside investment. China is an example of this. China relies on the world buying its goods. And now since we in the West aren't buying as many goods from China anymore, their growth is also slowing down. India is another country that relies on the outside world. And in India's case, there's actually a very specific example from last summer. The Indian rupee, their currency, lost a good chunk of its value last summer simply because the Federal Reserve decided to make a simple tweak to its monetary policy. Very innocently, it didn't think anything would happen, but it caused currency crises across the world. And because China's suffering, because India's suffering, you have countries like Australia who rely on mining exports suffering. You have the nations in the Middle East suffering because oil prices are falling. The point I'm trying to make, as you can probably tell by now, is the fact that when countries rely on opening themselves up to the global economy to grow, it integrates their economies. It ties the destinies of these economies together. And if a crisis happens in one place, it's going to happen everywhere else too. And we in the world of economics, and we in the world of politics, still aren't used to this fact. We've all gotten very used to the fact that companies will invest overseas, that they'll send jobs overseas, that they will participate in economic activity in more than just their own country. But we still have a tendency, both in our media and on the news, to blame countries entirely for the specific problems that happen in their own area. I myself was a victim of this problem. I focused extremely heavily in my questions in Rwanda on what the government might have been doing wrong, on what businesses might have been doing wrong, on what individuals might have been doing wrong. And that's all well and good up to a point. But we have to realize that the economic destinies of countries aren't entirely under their control. And the lesson to take from this is we need to build up the global institutions that we have to manage these kinds of crises. We need to build up our loan structures so countries like Rwanda can actually get access to the capital that they need. We need to build up our structures of debt relief so that if a country has a huge debt load left over from the time of a dictator, that it can actually get rid of that debt and move on. We need to build up our currency crossovers so that currencies don't prohibit a country from being able to trade. I could go on and on and on. The point you need to take from this, the lesson of Rwanda, is that we now live in one global economic community. We are one people. We live together, we die together, we work together, and all of our hopes and dreams are now united in one economic world. Simply put, we develop together. Thank you very much, everybody.